Program, a South Australian Royal Commission has delivered an eviscerating assessment of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan amid continuing scenes of ecological tragedy in parts of the Murray-Darling Basin river system. It has suggested water allocations were set unlawfully and won't achieve the aim of improving the health of the nation's largest river system. The Commissioner, Brett Walker SC, has recommended an overhaul, including allocating more water to the environment, even if that has social and economic consequences for irrigators. Political leaders are still digesting a 740-page report but are standing by the Basin Plan. We'll speak to the head of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority in a moment, but first, this report from political reporter Melissa Clark. There has been outstanding idealism but egregious shortcomings in the management of the Murray-Darling River system in the last decade, according to the report of the Royal Commission established by South Australia. Led by Brett Walker SC, it examined the Basin Plan and its allocation of water between the environment, irrigators and human consumption. He concluded that political considerations were given too much weight when deciding who gets how much water, and that under the law, the health of the river system should have been given the priority over social and economic concerns. He describes it as a major failure of process and says there's a pressing need to make changes so that more water is allocated to the environment.
Well, look, we'll be considering all of the findings and all of the recommendations, and we'll have a response later this year.
That's the South Australian Liberal Premier Steve Marshall. The Royal Commission was established by the previous Labor South Australian government, which wanted an overhaul of the plan. The Marshall government is treading more cautiously.
South Australia will be the loser if people start ripping up the original plan.
When the Basin Plan was signed in 2012, it was a historic moment, the first and only time there has been agreement across all of the Commonwealth, the states and the major political parties on how water should be allocated. The South Australian Attorney-General, Vicky Chapman, says the legal concerns the Commissioner raises are valid, but does not want to restart negotiations with other states.
But remember, the enforcement of all of this relies on the people around that table. And so what is key to us is to keep them at the table and obviously continue to fight. Even if there is some deficiencies in relation to the current plan, we're halfway through it and we want to continue to secure South Australia's interest.
The Commissioner's report was scathing of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority in particular, accusing it of an unfathomable predilection for secrecy, as well as maladministration and negligence. As well as allocating more water to the environment, recommendations from the Royal Commission include comprehensive and real-time metering of water flows, reconsidering the caps on water buybacks, and action against floodplain harvesting, where floodwaters are diverted into dams before the water ever reaches the river system. The Federal Agriculture Minister, David Littleproud, says he'll examine the recommendations closely.
It's way too early to make any assertions. This was a Royal Commission predicated in South Australia. The Basin obviously goes further than South Australia, but we respect what the Commissioner has done. He's done a significant body of work here that should be respected and should be looked at, and that's what we'll do.
But asked if more water should be reallocated from irrigation to the environment, Mr Littleproud stood firmly by the plan that was agreed in 2012.
This is a learning. We should learn what we can change, but the science is settled and people want certainty, and that's what we provided.
Tony Burke was the federal minister in charge when the Basin Plan was agreed to and is now the shadow Environment and Water Minister. He too has been cautious in his first response to the Commissioner's recommendations.
It's very easy to presume that volume is the only thing that restores the river to health. But there's a whole lot of constraints and rules that prevent large volumes from being effectively used.
Irrigators, who would stand to lose water under the Commissioner's recommendations, agree. Steve Ron, the CEO of the National Irrigators Council, says the current Murray-Darling Basin Plan took years to thrash out and says that going back to the drawing board would be a disaster.
Well, where does it leave us if we say, well, look, let's throw it all out and start again? I think that what we've seen in the Basin Plan is something which got bipartisan support, which set us on a track to actually recover a significant amount of water for the environment and improve the health of the basin, and I'm not sure that we want to go back to square one.
Environmental groups, on the other hand, have welcomed the Commissioner's report, including findings that climate change has not adequately been considered in setting water allocations. Commonwealth and Basin states are expected to meet to discuss the report soon, but there is nothing compelling them to adopt the Royal Commission's recommendations. Melissa Clark with that report. Well, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, which administers the plan, is still digesting the details of the Royal Commission's findings, but the authority's CEO of the last 3 years, Philip Glyde, denies any illegality in the authority's operations and says he's surprised by the findings. We spoke earlier. Philip Glyde, thank you for speaking with PM. This is a damning report on a slew of fronts alleging gross maladministration and negligence by the authority that you head. Should you now resign?
No, it's a very damning report, there's no doubt about that. We're the independent statutory authority, and when we see these sort of criticisms, we need to understand them. It's a 746-page report, and we'll be looking at it very carefully to understand why it is that the Royal Commission has come to these views, because in my experience, there's certainly been no maladministration, no illegal behaviour whatsoever. We've implemented the Water Act and the Basin Plan to the best of our abilities.
Well, the Water Act is one of the things that the Royal Commissioner says you've acted illegally on, that the interpretation has been illegal. Do you take that on board?
We know that that's been the view. I haven't had a chance to understand the reasoning behind the Commissioner's views. It's very important that we do that, but I would say that this is a plan that has been agreed by 6 governments. It's stood the test of time. The Commission is talking about a period in 2011-12 when the plan was set up. I'm quite surprised, because I'm sure all of those governments would have taken their own independent legal advice, as would the Commonwealth, as did the MDBA. And so it's really important that we understand where the Commission is coming from and seek to see whether that's the case. But in my experience, it's a very important institution. It behaves well. It's fully transparent. And I guess I'm surprised.
The report doesn't just toss in a loose claim against the authority. I mean, as you say, it's 740 pages more. It repeatedly puts the case, very strongly, repeatedly throughout, based on the evidence and the legalities that it has assembled under the stewardship of Brett Walker, SC, a very respected member of the legal fraternity in this country, and it says gross maladministration and negligence. Do you feel at the moment that there must be something here you missed?
It's certainly overwhelming, and I don't think there is anything we've missed, but I really do need to understand why it is that the Commissioner has come to this view, and we'll be responding in due course. There's a lot in that report that we need to understand. As an independent statutory authority fully funded by the taxpayer, we have no vested interest. We're the only ones with no skin in the game. All of the people that made evidence to the Commissioner all have their own interests, whether it's an industry interest, whether it's an environmental interest, whether it's a community interest. Everyone wants the best for their part of the basin. Our job is to implement a plan that is world-leading, that re-establishes the balance between the environment and industry, and we believe we've done that very effectively based on the best advice we can get. We're reforming 100 years of overuse. We're taking 20% of the water away from production, away from farmers, and giving it back to the environment. It's a pretty good down payment on some of the problems that have been identified with the Murray-Darling Basin.
Well, the report calls for a complete revamp of the water limits, the take and diversion limits, particularly in light of the calamity striking parts of the system right now. Will you back that recommendation?
No. I think it's really important to understand how hard it is to do this. We are 7 years into a 12-year implementation phase. What would worry me is that if we do that, if we pause, we step back and have another look at the new science, another look at what was done at the time, we will lose valuable time in this fundamental resetting of the way in which water is used in the Murray-Darling Basin.
Why should Australians have confidence in the MDBA in the light of this report's findings?
I think they should continue to have confidence in the MDBA until we have a good look at that, at those measures. We've been the MDBA and its predecessors have run the River Murray following the rules that have been agreed between basin governments for over 100 years. The Basin Plan is something that's been created by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. It has been supported by governments. I find it really surprising that despite all of that support from the state governments, that we now have a circumstance where someone has said that that's not working.
Okay, Philip Glyde, thank you very much for joining us on PM.
Thanks, Linda.
Philip Glyde is the CEO of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Well, Marianne Slattery is a former Director of Environmental Water at the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, and she's told the ABC's news podcast The Signal that she's not surprised by the report's findings. Now a water researcher at the Australia Institute, Ms Slattery says the authority was more concerned about political than environmental outcomes.
I think that the authority started to go down a bit of a slippery slope. I was first cognizant of it in about 2014, where you could see the science really being retrofitted for political outcomes. I certainly saw some creative modelling, and it manifests itself in a whole lot of ways in the organisation, and a lot of the things that the Royal Commissioners touched on, with science not being made publicly available, modelling reports not being made available, information that was publicly available has been, taken down off websites, spin and propaganda. I've certainly been a witness to that. And there were several other ex-Murray-Darling Basin Authority employees that made the same observation in their evidence to the Royal Commission.
Marianne Slattery is a former Director of Environmental Water at the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. Hear more on that podcast, The Signal in the Morning. You're listening to PM. I'm Linda Mottram. You can reach me on Twitter at...
Yeah, so Barnaby Joyce's chickens are all flying home to roost. And guess what? All of these chickens have grown up to be the size of emus. And it appears they're getting ready to kick his little foul house down. So the South Australian Royal Commission has found that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority acted illegally when they took the Murray-Darling Basin Plan and they shredded it because of the alleged social and economic impact on the basin communities, because the law legislated that the Murray-Darling Basin Committee, Murray-Darling Basin Authority, was supposed to give the environment and the economy equal weight, because you can't have any economy if you don't have an environment that's functional. And Barnaby Joyce and Barnaby Joyce's mates decided that that wasn't good enough for them. They didn't like the idea of only pumping out of the river during times of high flow, i.e. during a flood. They didn't like the idea of allowing the environment to have all of the water during times of medium and low flow, i.e. when it's not raining. So in 2012, 2013, when Barnaby Joyce, who was leader of the National Party, became Deputy Prime Minister, he got the portfolio for agriculture, he got the portfolio for resources, and they took responsibility from water away from the Environment Minister and they gave it to Barnaby Joyce as Resources Minister. He reversed the paradigm. And he said it's perfectly okay for all the upstream irrigators to take their entire allocation out of the river during times of low and medium flow. And when it's flooding and they can't physically pump any more water into their tanks and there's all of that water going downstream, that's what we're going to laughingly call environmental flows. And now all the fish are dead, because instead of letting the river system recover from the millennial drought, which was what Tony Windsor was trying to do, he was my MP before Barnaby Joyce. Barnaby Joyce got his mates to grow the biggest crops they could during the good years and then suck the river dry going into the drought. So we've just had a year with bugger all rain. Now all the fish are dead and we're going into an El Nino. So guess what, fellas? What we can expect is maybe no serious rain for another year. Yeah? How's that going to be? What's going to be left in the rivers then? All of those people who couldn't be bothered leaving some water for the environment so that there would be some resilience in the landscape to cope with the drought, all of those people in the inland towns, they're all going to run out of water and maybe get burnt, because the kind of bushfires we're going to be facing when there's no water in the environment, no water in the river, no water in the dams. Oh, hoo-yow bang, I wouldn't want to be out there. It's going to be bad enough here because we might get some rain. You know, like we only missed out on 34% of our rain last year. And Barnaby Joyce's entire political career has been dedicated to ignoring climate science, to denying that global warming is actually an existential threat to humanity. He's spent his whole political career trying to suck more water out of the Murray-Darling Basin for the benefit of his mates in the irrigation industry, and trying to promote Australia's extraction and burning and sale overseas of ever more fossil fuels. This is Barnaby Joyce's drought. That's why they made him the Drought Envoy. He runs around the country speaking on behalf of the drought because it's his drought. He brought it to us. It's 385% drier and it's 14.75% hotter than Tony Windsor's droughts used to be back in the day. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.